Unit 731, a military base in the middle of nowhere, barbed wire, armed guards, and inside, something so horrifying that the people running it made sure the world would never find out. This was Unit 731, Northeast China, 1937 to 1945. Officially, a water purification unit. In reality, a death factory funded by the Imperial Japanese Army. The prisoners brought here, Chinese, Korean, Russian, Mongolian, weren't called prisoners. They were called maruta. That's Japanese for logs of wood. That's how much their lives were worth to the people in charge. What happened inside is almost impossible to describe. Scientists deliberately infected people with plague, cholera, anthrax. No warning, no anesthesia. They froze limbs solid, thawed them, froze them again, just to watch the damage. They performed live surgeries on conscious prisoners because they believed painkillers would contaminate their data. They removed organs from people who were still alive. And when they ran out of things to test in the lab, they went outside. They dropped plague-infected fleas over entire Chinese cities. They poisoned water supplies. Between the experiments and the field attacks, historians estimate this program killed hundreds of thousands of people. But here's the part that hits differently. After the war, the United States knew. American officials quietly offered the scientists full immunity from prosecution in exchange for the data, the research, soaked in blood. No trials, no justice. The facility was demolished, the records were burned. Japan officially denied Unit 731 existed for decades. The truth eventually came out, but the people responsible, they lived out the rest of their lives in comfort. That's not just a war crime. That's a deal made in the dark, and it tells you something about how the world actually works.
Nazi experiments. The Nazi concentration camps are remembered for the mass killings, but inside those same camps, something else was happening, something that wore the mask of science. Nazi doctors, men who had sworn to heal people, they were conducting experiments on prisoners who had no rights, no voice, and no way out. The most notorious was Joseph Mengele. They called him the Angel of Death at Auschwitz. He had a specific obsession, twins. He would personally select them from the arriving trains, separate them, and then run parallel experiments, injecting dye into their eyes trying to change their color, performing surgery without anesthesia, infecting one twin with a disease to compare the outcome with their healthy sibling. When he was done, many were killed by injection to the heart, so both could be autopsied at the same time. But it wasn't just Mengele. At Dachau, prisoners were submerged in ice water for hours to find out how long downed pilots they'd survive in the North Sea. Many died in the tanks. At high-altitude chambers, prisoners were pressurized until their eardrums burst and their eyes hemorrhaged. Bones were grafted, removed, transplanted without consent or pain relief. Mass sterilization experiments were performed on Jewish and Roma prisoners. Thousands were exposed to tuberculosis, typhus, and malaria on purpose. Somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people went through this. Most didn't come out. After the war, 23 Nazi doctors were put on trial at Nuremberg. 7 were executed. The rest received prison sentences. But the legacy of those trials matters more than the sentences. The Nuremberg Code, the foundation of modern medical ethics, was written directly because of what these men did. Voluntary consent, informed participation, the right to withdraw. Every ethical rule in medicine today exists because someone decided to break all of them first.
You've heard of Unit 731, but there was another Japanese biological warfare program running at the same time, one that history has almost completely forgotten. It was called Unit 100. On paper, it was a veterinary unit. Its official name was the Kwantung Army Military Horse Epidemic Prevention Workshop. That's a very boring name for a very horrifying operation. Unit 100 was based near Changchun in Manchuria, and its mission was to weaponize disease, specifically animal and plant diseases. The strategy was cold and calculated. You don't have to kill the enemy's soldiers if you can destroy their food supply. Kill the livestock, contaminate the crops, starve the population. Scientists here deliberately infected horses, cattle, sheep with anthrax, glanders, rinderpest, foot and mouth disease, studying how these diseases spread and how they could be deployed as weapons. They developed methods for poisoning water supplies and tested biological sabotage techniques in Chinese territory. And like Unit 731, they didn't stop at animals. Chinese and Soviet prisoners were subjected to lethal injections, biological experiments, and live autopsies. The same disregard for human life, the same methods, just a different target. When Soviet forces swept into Manchuria in August 1945, Unit 100 scrambled to cover its tracks. Animals were killed, records burned, buildings demolished. Personnel captured by the Soviets were tried in the Harabask war crimes trial in 1949 and sentenced to labor camps. The Western world barely noticed, barely reported it, has largely forgotten it. Unit 100 exists in the shadow of Unit 731, but the people who died there weren't in a shadow, they were real, and the fact that their story gets a fraction of the attention says something uncomfortable about whose deaths we choose to remember. The Nanjing Massacre, December 13, 1937. The Japanese army enters the Chinese capital of Nanjing. The battle is over. The city has fallen. What followed over the next 6 weeks became one of the most documented and most disputed atrocities of World War II. The soldiers were given effective license to do whatever they wanted, and what they did is almost impossible to summarize without losing the weight of it. Historians estimate between 100,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and surrendered soldiers were killed. Mass executions by machine gun, bayoneting, burning alive, beheadings. Japanese newspapers at the time actually reported on competitions between officers to see who could kill 100 people with a sword first. They printed names in scores like a sports leaderboard. The sexual violence was systematic. Entire neighborhoods were burned to the ground. But here's one of history's strangest details. A German Nazi party member named John Raab helped save up to 200,000 Chinese civilians. He used his German credentials to establish a safety zone and document everything he witnessed. His diaries are one of the most important records of what happened. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo trials, found General Matsui and others guilty. Matsui was executed. But for decades, the event has sat at the center of a political battle between China and Japan. Some Japanese nationalist politicians have denied or minimized it. China has made it a cornerstone of national memory. The numbers are contested. The suffering isn't. And the real cost isn't counted in any statistic. It's in the names that were never recorded, the stories that disappeared with the people who lived them. The Holocaust, 6 million. That number is too big to hold, but try. The Holocaust, the Nazi Germany's systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions more, didn't begin in a gas chamber. It began with paperwork. Laws, definitions. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jewish people of citizenship, then of jobs, then of freedom of movement, then of the right to marry non-Jewish Germans. The state redefined an entire group of people as non-human, step by step, law by law, before the killing even began. In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen followed the army and shot Jews, Roma, and Soviet officials in mass graves across Eastern Europe. More than 1 million people died this way. At a single pit outside Kyiv, Babi Yar, 33,771 Jews were shot over 2 days in September 1941. Then came the death camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor. People were transported across Europe by train.
At arrival, most were directed straight to gas chambers disguised as shower rooms and killed within hours. Auschwitz alone killed an estimated 1.1 million people. Those kept for labor were worked until they collapsed from starvation, disease, exhaustion. Children separated from parents on train platforms, families destroyed in minutes. This was not the work of a handful of madmen. It required the cooperation of an entire government, bureaucrats, train operators, ordinary soldiers, neighbors who gave names to the authorities. The Nuremberg trials created entirely new categories of international law, crimes against humanity, genocide, because existing law had no language for what had happened. 6 million people, and the world watched, largely in silence, while it happened. That's not just Germany's failure. That's a failure of the entire human system. And the question we still can't fully answer: how do you make sure it never happens again?
Katyn Massacre. Here's a question. What if one of your closest allies during World War II committed a massive war crime and you covered it up for decades because the truth was inconvenient? That's exactly what happened with the Katyn Massacre, and the cover-up involved the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Spring 1940, Poland had been invaded and divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, had taken around 250,000 Polish prisoners. Among them were 22,000 men who were about to be selected for execution. Military officers, lawyers, doctors, professors, engineers, government officials, the educated backbone of Polish society. NKVD chief Lavrenti Beria wrote to Stalin with a recommendation: kill them all. Stalin signed the order. Over several weeks, prisoners were taken in small groups to the forest near Smolensk, hands bound behind their backs and shot in the head with a German pistol, then buried in mass graves. The goal was explicit: eliminate the people who could rebuild Poland into a nation capable of resisting Soviet control. In 1943, German forces found the graves and announced the discovery. The Soviet Union immediately blamed the Nazis. The Polish government in exile demanded an investigation. Stalin severed diplomatic relations with them for asking. And here's the part that's truly damning. British and American officials suppressed evidence that the Soviets were responsible because they needed Stalin as an ally against Hitler. The truth was inconvenient, so the lie was protected at the highest levels of government for a half-century. It wasn't until 1990 that the Soviet Union officially admitted responsibility. The following year, the original execution order signed by Stalin himself was released to the public. Katyn is a story about murder, but it's also a story about what powerful governments will hide and for how long when the truth gets in the way.
Tokyo firebombing. March 10, 1945. Just after midnight, over 300 American B-29 bombers approached Tokyo at low altitude. They're not carrying conventional bombs. They're carrying fire. The man behind this was General Curtis LeMay. Previous high-altitude bombing campaigns against Japan had been largely ineffective. Cloud cover, dispersed targets, inaccurate. LeMay made a brutal calculation. Japan's cities are made of wood and paper. Use incendiary bombs. Burn them down. The bombers dropped thousands of M69 napalm cluster bombs across Tokyo's most densely populated neighborhoods. The fires merged, the wind picked up, a firestorm developed, temperatures reaching 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The canals and rivers boiled. People who jumped into the water to escape the flames were cooked alive. In 3 hours, 15 to 16 square miles of Tokyo were reduced to ash. Between 80,000 and 100,000 people were killed in a single night. 1 million people were left homeless. And that was just the beginning. The firebombing campaign continued for months. By the end, 67 Japanese cities had been destroyed. Total civilian deaths across the campaign are estimated between 250,000 and 900,000. LeMay himself acknowledged the weight of what he had ordered. He said publicly that if America had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. That's a remarkable thing to say. It shows he understood exactly what he'd done. The Tokyo firebombing doesn't fit neatly into the story America tells about World War II. It sits in the uncomfortable space between military necessity and mass civilian death, a place where the facts are clear, but the moral verdict is still being written.
Bombing of Dresden, February 1945. The war in Europe is nearly over. Germany is collapsing. The Soviet army is coming from the east. The Allies are pushing from the west. Victory is weeks, maybe months away. And then the bombers turned toward Dresden. Dresden was known as the Florence on the Elbe, one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. Baroque palaces, famous museums, porcelain, art, architecture. It had been largely untouched by the war until that February. On the nights of February 13th and 14th, over 1,200 British and American aircraft dropped nearly 4,000 tons of bombs on the city in 4 waves. Incendiary bombs created firestorms. The historic city center, centuries of art, architecture, and culture, was incinerated. The death toll has been fiercely debated. Early figures, some inflated by Nazi propaganda, claimed hundreds of thousands of dead. Modern historical research, including a study commissioned by the city of Dresden itself, places the number at approximately 22,500 to 25,000. That revision matters, but 25,000 civilian deaths is still a catastrophe. The controversy is real. Was Dresden a legitimate military target? It had rail lines, military depots, some industrial capacity. Germany was also still fighting. The war wasn't officially over yet. Supporters of the bombing argue it served a military purpose and was no different from hundreds of other Allied raids. Critics counter, the war was nearly won. The city was full of refugees. The destruction served more to terrorize a civilian population than to defeat an enemy military. What's not debated, one of Europe's most beautiful cities was turned to rubble in a single night. The firestorm consumed the old town completely. Dresden asks the hardest question in wartime ethics. When does military necessity end? And what were we willing to destroy to answer it? Mustard gas experiment. Here's something most people don't know. During World War II, the United States, Britain, and other Allied nations ran secret experiments exposing their own soldiers to chemical weapons. Not enemies, their own people. The justification was research. Mustard gas had been used since World War I. The major powers had enormous stockpiles. Nobody was sure how to protect against it, so they needed data, and they used human beings to get it. In the United States, thousands of servicemen were placed in gas chambers, had mustard gas rubbed directly onto their skin, and were exposed in enclosed rooms with no protective equipment. Many were Black, Puerto Rican, or Japanese American soldiers, and documents later confirmed that some tests were specifically designed to study whether different racial groups had different sensitivity to the gas. More severe tests on some groups than others. The men were sworn to secrecy. When they came home with burns, respiratory problems, and cancer years later, the Veterans Administration told many of them their conditions were not service-related. No compensation, no acknowledgement, for decades. In Britain, similar experiments ran at Porton Down. Servicemen were told they were participating in a study for a cure for the common cold. In 1953, a 20-year-old RAF serviceman named Ronald Madison was exposed to sarin nerve agent during one of these tests.
He died the same day. An official inquest returned the verdict of misadventure. 50 years later, a new inquest overturned that verdict. It was ruled an unlawful killing. Japan, as we've already discussed, went even further, running lethal chemical weapon tests on prisoners in China with no pretense of research ethics whatsoever. These were nations that claimed to stand against exactly this kind of thing. The men who survived lived with the contradiction and the damage for the rest of their lives.
Nuclear bomb, August 6, 1945. 8:15 in the morning. The skies over Hiroshima are clear. A single B-29 called Enola Gay opens its bomb bay doors. 43 seconds later, at 1,900 feet above the city, a bomb called Little Boy detonates. The fireball reaches several million degrees Celsius. Within a mile of ground zero, every structure is destroyed. People standing in the open are vaporized. Their shadows are burned into stone walls. The firestorm that follows consumes what the blast left standing. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people die instantly. By the end of 1945, counting those killed by radiation, burns, and injuries, the death toll reaches somewhere between 90,000 and 166,000. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, falls on Nagasaki. Another 40,000 dead immediately, up to 80,000 total by year's end. Japan surrenders on August 15th. The war is over. And then the debate begins, and it has never stopped. The American government's argument: the bombs prevented a land invasion of Japan that would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese ones. The bombs ended the war, and in this terrible math, saved more lives than they took. The counter-argument: Japan was already near collapse. The Soviet declaration of war just days before the second bomb may have been more decisive. Alternatives were available and not exhausted. Targeting civilian cities was, by any consistent standard, a war crime. Both arguments contain truth. Neither resolves it. What is not in dispute: the Hidokusha, the survivors, lived with radiation sickness, cancer, and burns for the rest of their lives. Many were shunned in Japan, as if survival itself had made them untouchable. The atomic bombings didn't just end World War II, they opened a new chapter in human history, one where, for the first time, we had proven we could destroy ourselves entirely. That knowledge has never left. It sits under every diplomatic table, every arms deal, every close call since, a shadow the 20th century cast, and that we are still living inside. In the end, all I want to say is nobody likes to be burned alive, or even worse. In wars, there are no winners. Everyone loses.